The year is 1502. Winter clings to the brick streets of Ferrara like an old debt unpaid. Inside the Est Castle, the grand halls are suffused with the scent of rose oil and old stone, and the night hums with the unease of history in motion. The city has not slept. Neither has the Pope's daughter. In a high chamber above the frozen moat, Lucrezia Borgia stands motionless before the mirror. Her gown of gold-threaded silk ripples with every hesitant breath. Her maids move around her like ghosts, fastening pearls, arranging her hair into a crown of living flame. Somewhere below, trumpets have fallen silent. The revelry has ended. Only the watchers remain. They call it the consummation witnessing. It sounds absurd now, the notion that a union so intimate could be verified by an audience. But in the 15th century, legitimacy was currency. A dynasty could live or die based on whether two bodies fulfilled a contract written in Latin and sealed by Rome. Outside the bedchamber, a small assembly waits. Envoys from the Este family, notaries, clerks, a papal observer sent from the Vatican. Their quills are ready, their expressions studiedly neutral. The door stands open just enough for them to hear what must be heard, to see what must be seen. A velvet curtain, thin, translucent, divides propriety from duty. The bridegroom, Alfonso d'Este, enters first. He is a soldier with a blacksmith's hands, his presence quiet but unyielding. He bows not to his wife, but to the witnesses, as if saluting a tribunal. Behind him, Lucrezia follows, her steps unhurried, her face unreadable. No one speaks. The only sound is the low hiss of the fire and the soft clink of metal as Alfonso removes his belt. Some say Lucrezia trembled. Others swear she did not. The records differ. Scribes, even in their obedience, could not escape the allure of myth. What is certain is this. When she looked toward the curtain, her eyes did not plead for privacy. They challenged it. One chronicler would later write, "She bore herself as one who knows the gaze of men to be both weapon and mirror." The ritual began. The bed itself was an altar, its linens embroidered with the Este crest, its posts carved with lions and lilies. Upon it lay the tokens of witness, a small silver crucifix, a candle, a parchment where signatures would later confirm the act. A servant stood ready with ink and sand to blot the truth once it was written. The night stretched thin. Outside, bells marked the turning of hours. The air grew heavy, the candlelight unsteady. Those in the antechamber listened to the rhythm of breath and silence, waiting for the sign that the alliance had been sealed, not by diplomacy, but by flesh. When the curtain finally stirred and the scribe's quill scratched the parchment, Ferrara itself seemed to exhale. The ritual was complete. But history, cruel as it is, never stops at completion. Moments later, one of the papal secretaries, a thin man with trembling hands, whispered to his companion, "3 times, they say it must be done. 3 to make it holy." The other man frowned. "And if the bride refuses?" "Then Ferrara loses everything." The words floated like ash in the lamplight. In that instant, the scene transformed from ceremony to performance, a stage where power danced in shadows. For every act of love, there was a counterbalance of strategy. For every breath taken in passion, another was recorded in ink. Lucrezia understood. She had learned too much of men and their kingdoms to believe this night belonged to her. The first cry that left her lips was not pain, nor pleasure. It was declaration. Let them write. Let them witness. Let them all see that she, the daughter of scandal, could make an empire kneel. Outside, the cold pressed against the castle walls. The scribes sealed their notes. Somewhere, a dove struck against a window pane, startled from its roost. The wind carried the smell of smoke from the city's chimneys, faint but insistent. In the morning, Ferrara would awaken to celebration. The bells would toll for unity, and couriers would race across Italy with news that the marriage had been fulfilled. But for those who had stood behind that curtain, The memory would not fade. They had seen power made flesh. They had watched politics breathe. And for Lucrezia, it was only the beginning. She had turned submission into theater, obedience into authorship. The curtain would close that night, but the audience would never leave. In centuries to come, historians would argue whether what happened in that room was love or calculation, whether the witnesses recorded history or simply helped create a legend. But the truth lingers in the silence between their words. That night, a woman was made both spectacle and sovereign, and the ink they used to document her became the first line of her dominion. The candles burned to their sockets. The last scribe folded his parchment, unaware that what he had written was not just evidence, it was prophecy. For even as dawn crept across the battlements, Lucrezia Borgia lay awake, eyes open, staring at the ceiling where shadows moved like ghosts of futures yet unclaimed. The witnesses had left, but she knew they would never truly go. They would haunt her, follow her, whisper her name through marble corridors for centuries to come, because some nights in history never end. They only wait for the next chapter to be told. Ferrara woke to frost and rumor. The castle's towers stood like frozen sentinels, their battlements veiled in white breath. Inside, the fire in the ducal chambers burned low, throwing long shadows across the floor, and within those shadows, Lucrezia Borgia began to rise, not from sleep, but from strategy. It had been months since the wedding, yet the memory of that night still lingered in the corners of every whisper. 3 times, they said. 3 times the ritual was witnessed, documented, and sealed. 3 times, as if the number itself had been forged in divine geometry. And with each repetition, Lucrezia had reclaimed a piece of her destiny. Her first husband had died under suspicion of impotence. Her second, strangled inside the Vatican's own walls. Now, as Duchess of Ferrara, she stood before a mirror not as a victim of politics, but as its composer. The reflection staring back at her wore no crown, yet it carried the calm certainty of someone who understood that the game was no longer about survival. It was about dominion. The court of Ferrara was unlike Rome. Here, poetry and poison shared the same table. Alfonso d'Este ruled with iron discipline, and the Duchess learned quickly that power in Ferrara flowed not from sword or scripture, but from reputation. She mastered it as one might master an instrument, softly at first, then with symphonic precision. In the great hall, under the frescoed ceiling of gods and angels, Lucrezia began to play her part. She hosted banquets that dazzled the nobles into silence, weaving diplomacy into laughter, forgiveness into feasts. Musicians played the lute as gold plates gleamed under candlelight. Yet, behind every toast, every smile, letters were being written, letters sealed in wax and carried through secret channels to Venice, Florence, and the Vatican. Ferrara's courtiers called her the Golden Duchess. Rome, less forgiving, called her something else. Serpent with a rosary. One ambassador sneered in private, but none could deny her reach. One winter evening, Alfonso found her writing by the window, her quill dancing between the candle and the snow. "You write as if to summon spirits," he said, half amused. She didn't look up. "Only men who think they're gods." He laughed, unaware of how true her words were. For every enemy who tried to corner her, Lucrezia built a mirror that turned their ambition back upon them. When Pope Alexander VI, her father, died in 1503, most expected her power to wither overnight. Instead, she absorbed the blow in silence, cloaking grief in grace. While others scrambled to secure alliances, she strengthened Ferrara's coffers, negotiated trade, and soothed rival families with gestures of disarming piety. She attended Mass daily, distributed alms to the poor, and knelt where all could see her. Yet those who met her gaze in prayer swore they felt the weight of calculation in her eyes. "She prays like a saint," one monk whispered, "but her silence feels like judgment." There was artistry in her restraint. While Italy's courts drowned in rumor, Lucrezia's image became untouchable, a paradox too sacred to attack outright. She had learned that survival depended not on innocence, but on perception. And perception was something she sculpted like marble. When envoys from France arrived, they found her in white velvet, reading Petrarch aloud beneath the fresco of St. Catherine. When Venetian diplomats came, she received them in the garden, the scent of orange blossoms masking the ink on her latest ciphered correspondence. Her influence rippled outward, invisible yet undeniable. But the greater her serenity, the more her enemies grew restless. Her sister-in-law, Isabella d'Este, the famed Marchesa of Mantua, watched with quiet rage as Lucrezia's radiance outshone her own. Once the unrivaled jewel of Italy's courts, Isabella now found her letters to kings answered days late. Her invitations declined. The whispers were clear. Ferrara had a new son. The rivalry between the two women was a war fought in smiles and silks. Isabella sent gifts, perfumed gloves, a painted fan, each carrying subtle insults. Lucrezia responded with flawless diplomacy. "Her generosity is boundless," she wrote publicly, while privately commissioning portraits that made Isabella's beauty look almost provincial. One night, during a masked festival, Isabella approached her, eyes glinting through the gold filigree of her mask. "Tell me, sister," Isabella said, her voice low, "do you ever tire of pretending to be divine?" Lucrezia smiled, a slow, deliberate motion. "Only when I must remind others that I'm human." The music swelled, and the Duchess drifted back into the crowd, her laughter dissolving into the strings of a viol. It was around this time that a series of secret correspondences began to circulate between Ferrara and Mantua. The letters were unsigned but written in an unmistakable hand, Isabella's husband, Francesco Gonzaga. What began as courtesy became confession, and soon, rumor. A friendship turned illicit alliance, or perhaps a carefully chosen blade. No one could prove it. Yet, for the first time, Isabella's face tightened when Lucrezia's name was mentioned. The Duchess had learned to play God, not by thunder or decree, but through the quiet rearrangement of mortal hearts. Still, her triumph was not without cost. In private, she suffered bouts of melancholy, as though the splendor around her had grown too loud. Servants whispered of her sleepless nights, of candles burning until dawn. When asked what troubled her, she would answer softly, "The silence between bells." Outside, Ferrara flourished under her steady hand. Roads were repaired, festivals renewed, scholars and artists summoned from across Italy. The Duchess had made her husband's city the envy of the peninsula. Yet power, like perfume, never truly stays contained. By the spring of 1505, letters once again began to arrive from Rome, this time bearing no blessing, only warning. The papacy had changed hands. New alliances were being forged, old debts collected, and among the cardinals, a question began to circulate, cloaked in intrigue. If the daughter of the Borgia Pope had survived the fall of her family, what else might she be capable of surviving? As dusk fell on Ferrara, Lucrezia stood by her window, watching the sky darken to violet. Below her, the city lights flickered like votive candles. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour, echoing through the empty streets. She whispered to herself, almost tenderly, "They believe I have God's favor. Perhaps they're right." Then, with a slow, measured motion, she extinguished the candle beside her desk, leaving only the faint scent of smoke and the question that would haunt Italy for years to come. Had Lucrezia Borgia ceased to be the Pope's daughter, or had she simply learned to rule as his equal? When dawn finally came to Ferrara, it crept like a thief afraid to be seen. The light crawled over the stone walls, licking the tapestries where shadows had conspired just hours before. In the grand hall, where nobles had gathered to witness sanctity masquerading as scandal, the air still smelled faintly of wax, musk, and judgment. The marriage bed, once the stage of proof, now stood stripped, its linens folded and carried away like relics from a sacred crime. Outside, the city began to breathe again. Bells rang for mass, merchants opened their stalls, and gossip fluttered like ash through the streets. But within the ducal palace, silence endured, a silence so dense it seemed to hold memory hostage. Lucrezia Borgia sat by the window, her hair unbound, her eyes following the pale light that bled into the curtains. She was no longer the trembling bride of the night before. Her face, calm as polished marble, betrayed neither triumph nor sorrow. The witnesses had left, the documents sealed, yet something invisible had been signed in a deeper court, an oath of destiny written not in ink, but in breath and fear. "Your Grace," came a voice from the doorway. It was Angela Benti, her attendant, still pale from the night's ordeal. "The Duke requests your presence at morning prayers." Lucrezia turned her gaze slowly, her voice measured and almost tender. "Tell His Grace that I shall join him soon. The sun has only just learned my name." Angela hesitated, uncertain whether to smile or bow. Then she slipped away, leaving the Duchess to her thoughts. What had truly been witnessed that night? Was it the union of man and woman, or the birth of something far greater, something no priest could sanctify? Beyond Ferrara's gates, word of the consummation traveled faster than parchment could carry it. Couriers rode through the Aemilia plains bearing letters to Rome, Venice, and Naples. Some proclaimed it a victory for the Este family. Others whispered it was an omen. "The Pope's daughter," they murmured, "has done it again." But the truth was simpler and far more terrible. In that night's spectacle, Lucrezia had ceased to be merely a woman. She had become a symbol, one that even she could not yet decipher. Days turned into weeks. The ducal palace resumed its rhythm of ceremony and control. Feasts were held, poets summoned, emissaries entertained. Yet, in every banquet, behind every curtain, the shadow of that night stretched long and unbroken. One evening, during a quiet supper, Duke Alfonso leaned toward his new wife, his voice low and edged with curiosity. "They say your father watches even from Rome. Do you ever feel his eyes upon you?" Lucrezia met his gaze with a faint, practiced smile. "My father watches everything. Even the stars must seek his permission to burn." The Duke chuckled, but uneasily. He had inherited a duchy. She had inherited the world's suspicion. In that balance, neither could truly rest. Years unfurled like silk banners in the wind. Children were born and baptized, alliances forged in candlelight and broken in the dark. Ferrara prospered under Lucrezia's quiet governance. She wrote letters in her own cipher, sent gifts of rare amber and gold-threaded lace to bishops and princes alike. Yet, behind her measured grace, there lingered that same flicker from the wedding night, a glint of something eternal, untamed. Scholars later said she ruled through charm. Poets claimed she ruled through beauty. But those who truly knew whispered another truth. She ruled through remembrance. Every noble in Ferrara remembered that night. The way silence had stretched, the way the quills had trembled, the way the Duchess's eyes had met the witnesses without flinching. That image became legend, and legend became law. No decree could rival the authority of her poise. Even as the papal tides shifted and enemies plotted, her reign endured, not by sword or sermon, but by the precision of her silence. In 1519, when illness began to wither her body, she asked for no confessor, no relic, no repentance. Instead, she requested her room be lit with the same number of candles that had burned on her wedding night. "Let them burn," she said softly, "until the morning forgets to come." Her attendants obeyed, and as the hours passed, Ferrara seemed to pause, as if holding its breath once more. The candles melted into pools of gold, their flames bending in unseen drafts. Somewhere in the corridors a door creaked, a sound like memory turning over in its sleep. When the final candle flickered out, dawn once again crept over Ferrara. But this time it found no witnesses, no parchment, no proof. Only a legend, a woman who had learned to command time itself. And in the hush that followed, the city swore it could still hear her whisper in the walls. Some nights never end. They simply change their disguise. Ferrara exhaled. The dynasty lived on. The witnesses had gone home long ago, but the ritual had never stopped.